Hello there. Welcome back. This is part 3 in our series on, well, truth as the big topic, but in this particular case, we're talking about the pursuit of truth. By way of review, we started in the first talk about the social dilemma, and here's a quote from one of the main figures in the social dilemma, where he says, "If we don't agree on what is true, or that there is such a thing as truth, we're toast. This," he says, "is the problem beneath other problems. Because if we can't agree on what's true, then we can't navigate out of any of our problems." Now, I think he's right on. And so that led to our second talk about the nature of truth. We weren't yet talking about how to find it, but what it is we're even looking for. And so just by way of review, if you want to go back and look at the second video, you'll see a lot more of this, but I want to quickly review a few points because you'll see that it actually has a lot of relevance to what we're doing today. So principle 1, we said, is that to believe is to assent to a proposition, which is to say to agree with it, to judge that it's true. So in this diagram, you see it says, "I believe that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree." Now, the assent, the agreement, is the personal recognition or at least the belief that this proposition is true. The proposition, though, is George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. Now, what's critical to understand here is that insofar as I'm talking about my assent to it, I'm talking about myself, not George Washington, right? But insofar as I'm talking about the purple part, George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, I'm not talking about myself anymore. I'm talking about George Washington. That's the proposition that is in question. Is that true or false? So principle 2 is there's a difference between the subjective act of believing, again, my assenting, your dissenting, and the objective truth or falsity of the proposition that we're believing. Principle 3 is, therefore, that it's possible to believe a false proposition, okay, so I'm assenting to a proposition thinking it's true, but in fact it's false, or to disbelieve a true proposition. Principle 4 was that what makes a proposition true or false is not whether one believes it or disbelieves it, but whether it corresponds to reality. And you'll recall this image here of the empty tomb. So here you have Mr. Stick Figure believing in his mind that Jesus rose from the dead. That is his belief. Now that proposition, Jesus rose from the dead, corresponds to reality or it doesn't. Okay? There's no other option. Either he did rise from the dead or he did not. What makes that proposition true, though, and this is the critical point that we have to get clear on in this postmodern subjective culture, is that it's the reality, not the believing of the proposition. Okay? What makes a proposition true is not how fervently I believe it, how many people believe it, how sincere they are, whether they're authorities, scientists, philosophers. It doesn't matter. The question is ultimately, what is reality like? So that then leads to today's discussion. How do we know whether a proposition is true or false? Okay, so a proposition, again, sorry for kicking a dead horse, but it's either true or it's false. The question we're asking now is, how do we know which it is? How do we know whether it's true or whether it's false? So here's a book. Many of you may have heard of this, Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, a Christian apologist. And this book is loaded with evidence. Evidence, as we'll see, is what we're after here, because it's evidence, on the basis of evidence, that we find which propositions are true and which are false. I define evidence as that in view of which one assents to a proposition. So if you look at this example, the question is, why do you believe that Joe murdered Sue? And the answer is because his fingerprints were on the murder weapon. Now, the yellow arrow there is pointing out the fact that that is the thing that he is viewing or considering as his evidence for the proposition that Joe murdered Sue. That's pretty much how we go about forming our beliefs. It's always in view of some kind of evidence. The problem is that evidence divides into good, bad, and iffy. So if you look to the bottom left here, you see a doctor showing what appears to be a scan of, we'll say, the lady's, I don't know, her bones or something like that, and presumably he's trying to persuade her that this is her condition. And we would say that's good evidence. Up above, you see palm reading. We would say that's bad evidence. It doesn't change the fact, though, that people view it as a basis for belief. And then, for those of you who are a bit older, you'll recall the O.J. Simpson trial when he puts on the gloves. And at the very least, we would call that iffy evidence. Some would say it was good, some would say it's bad. But what this is showing us is that we always form our beliefs on the basis of evidence, but that doesn't mean the evidence is good evidence. It could be bad evidence, which then raises the question, how do we know which is which? Now, I want to introduce you to a concept, the concept of justification, that is really crucial for understanding our pursuit of truth. I'm calling this the penultimate goal. Penultimate means not the ultimate, but right next to it. Now, justified belief is a belief that has been reasonably formed in view of good evidence. So here you see a young lady who is presumably trying to find out the truth about some particular case. And so you see the legal books behind her. So we could use that as an image of someone who's trying to form reasonable beliefs on the basis of good evidence. Unjustified belief, then, would be a belief that has been unreasonably formed in view of bad evidence. So here's a pretty dramatic example. Guy's looking at a magic 8-ball. Let's say he's trying to figure out, is the person guilty or not? And he shakes the 8-ball and it says, yes, definitely. Well, that's his evidence. And if he's simple-minded enough to believe that, that would be sad, but it would be bad evidence. And we would hopefully dismiss that as any kind of good argument. Now, again, that's a dramatic example. There are lots of other more realistic examples of bad evidence. But we're going to focus on the problem of good evidence. Okay? So I want to make 2 points here, 2 warnings. Warning 1 is that unjustified belief does not mean false belief. Okay? We got to get clear on the difference here between what we mean when we say a belief is true or false and what we mean when we say a belief is justified or unjustified. So this first warning here is that unjustified belief does not mean false belief. So here you see a person buying a lottery ticket. Now let's say that he believes this is going to be the winning ticket. Now, statistically, the odds are massively against him. So much so, in fact, that we would say that's not reasonable to really believe that that's going to be the winning ticket, right? And so we would say his belief is unjustified. It's not well evidenced, okay? It's flying in the face of evidence. And yet, someone draws the winning ticket, right? So let's say that this is in fact the winning ticket. What that means is he has a true belief that he has bought the winning ticket, but it's unjustified. Now, the flip side of this is true. You can have a justified belief, but that doesn't make it true. So let's just sort of reverse the situation here. Now let's say this person buys the ticket but thinks to himself, oh, there's no way this is the winning ticket. The odds are way against me. Okay? That would be a justified belief. That would be a reasonable belief in light of really good evidence. But it could be the case that it is the winning ticket, in which case his belief is false. So he has justified false belief. Here you see then that the problem is that even good evidence can be fallible. I have here two screenshots of a video. It's entitled The Half-Court Shot, where this poor guy here in the middle was pranked. This is at the University of Maryland, and the prankster managed to get the school to go along with him. And what happened was, at halftime, they had announced that they're going to pull someone out from the audience and give them a blindfolded shot at the half court. And thousands of dollars were potentially going to be won by this. And so they call this guy out of the audience who was already going to be pranked. He didn't know it. And they told the school that no matter what happens, they're to cheer wildly after he takes his shot. And so he gets to the half court, they blindfold him, they spin him, they direct him to the basket, and he throws his shot, and it does in fact miss wildly. But the commentator cries out, "You made it!" And the crowd goes wild, and this guy pulls off his blindfold, and he's just running around the court, so excited that he's won all this money. And then his friend comes out with a check for however much money it was, and pulls down the check. He sees his friend's face, and he realizes he's been pranked. So now think about this. Did he make the shot? No, he didn't. Did he win the money? No, he didn't. Did he have really, really good evidence of both of those propositions? The answer is yes, he did. He had excellent evidence. That's why pranks, particularly at this level, are so fun, because any person would have fallen for this. So now think about what we've established. Problem one is you can have a true but unjustified belief. That's the lottery example. Problem two is that you can have a justified but false belief. That's the half-court shot example. And this would suggest then that what we really want as a solution is justified true belief, right? This seems to combine the best of both worlds. It's a true belief, but it's also justified. And so that would seem to be what we're ultimately after. The problem, though, is that, as we'll see here, we still have yet to answer the question, how do we know whether a justified belief is also true? To understand what I mean by this, look at this picture of these two twins. These guys are pretty much identical. I would have a really hard time telling them apart. We'll just call the guy on the left John in the blue there, and Dave in the red. Now let's say we know John. The two of us know John. But we don't know that he has an identical twin brother. And one day, the two of us are in a grocery store, and we both see what we think is John. And after we leave the store, you say, "Hey, I saw John, and he was wearing a blue shirt." And I said, "Well, no, actually, it was a red shirt. I saw John as well, and it was a red shirt," right? Now, we'll go ahead and assume, though, that what happened was John was in the grocery store with his identical twin brother, Dave. We'll say that John did, in fact, have a blue shirt, and that Dave had a red shirt. And so I am the one who has a false belief, right? I say John had a red shirt when, in fact, it was blue. Now, who's justified here? Which of us is justified in our beliefs? Well, the answer, I think, is obvious that we both are. In fact, our evidence would appear to be equally good, right? We're looking at the same person as far as we can tell, and neither of us knows that there is an identical twin. And yet, your belief is true, and my belief is false. So this is a really important insight that leads to the next question. If the evidence is the same for both, okay, in this particular case, the only difference between justified true belief and justified false belief is that one happens to be true and the other happens to be false. And that seems to be putting it into the hands of luck, as it were, which is, I think, sort of an intolerable position to ultimately settle with. So the ultimate goal is to verify our beliefs. Let's think it through here, kind of as a review. We've said that our goal is to believe what is true. As important as it is to be reasonable, we are more concerned about being right. But, as we've now seen, there is a difference between justifiably believing what happens to be true and knowing that what we believe is true. We ultimately want two, not one. The problem, though, is that even good evidence can still be fallible evidence. That is to say, even probable evidence can mislead us into believing what is false. Therefore, we cannot settle with good evidence that is merely probable. What we ultimately want, then, is certainty, what philosophers have historically called certainty. And what we ultimately need, then, is what they have called infallible evidence. Infallible evidence. We want certainty of truth based on infallible evidence. That is a tall order. Okay, that is an ideal which some people think is unachievable. And we'll talk more about how that ties into what's called postmodernism. Before we do, the question, is infallible certainty of truth attainable, needs to be approached from what is, I think, the most common answer to that. Insofar as you say, yes, it is, you're probably going to say it is achievable by personal experience. Here you see a picture of doubting Thomas looking at the wound of Jesus. And this is typically used as an illustration of the idea of personally, directly using your five senses, particularly your eyes, to see something and verify it for yourself, to verify it directly, personally, by your five senses. This is a very, very common answer to the question of how do you achieve truth with certainty. The idea is you just open your eyes and you look. So we'll call this option one. Now, two versions of this option here that we need to get clear on, and we're going to look at both. One is that you can know something only if you see it with your own eyes, or feel it, hear it, smell it, taste it, as it were. But usually we talk about this in terms of sight. This claim makes personal sense experience a necessary condition for knowledge. That's why we have the only if there. We're saying that one can know something for certainty only if one sees it with one's own eyes. Another version of this is to say that if one sees it with one's own eyes, then one knows it. Okay? This makes personal sense experience a sufficient condition for knowledge. We're saying that if you see it, then you have the knowledge. Okay? Again, these are very commonly asserted claims. So I want to look at both of these. And in the process, I'm going to be very critical of these claims, but the goal is to try to direct us to the real nature of the kind of knowledge or certainty that we're after. So, first of all, is personal experience necessary for knowledge? In response to this, many have noted that we have not personally experienced the vast majority of things that we think we know. So taken literally, this idea of personal experience is very, very limited. We have not personally experienced countless people, cities, countries, animals, planets, etc., that we presumably know to exist. If you just stop and think about all the places in the world, all the things in the world that you think are out there that have certain characteristics, and then ask yourself, how many of those have you directly laid eyes upon and touched? The answer is very, very little. In fact, most of what we believe comes from indirect sources: photos, newspapers, books, testimonies, etc. And there's a sense, therefore, in which we're trusting in these sources. We're deeming them to be reliable. We're seeing them as sort of a medium by which we access something that we can't directly experience. I pick up the newspaper, it says such and such happened in Tokyo, and I believe it. Well, I'm not in Tokyo, so it's not directly experienced by me. I'm believing it based on the newspaper. So much of our beliefs are like that, whether it's academic, textbook-style beliefs in science, psychology, politics, history, the list goes on. So if we only know what we have personally experienced, then we know really none of those things, okay? And that seems counterintuitive. So a lot of people have said there's got to be something wrong here. Even more fundamentally, though, we cannot, notice the stress there, we cannot, even in principle and practice, personally experience with the senses, with the eyes, with the hands, much of what we think we know. So by definition, we cannot sense the subsensory realm, the microscopic, right? There was a long, long time before we even had microscopes. No one was able to access microbes and particles and so forth. So without the aid of those, you can't experience the vast majority of these things that you believe are real. Bacteria, you believe in bacteria. When's the last time you actually saw one yourself, right? How about the laws of nature, Newton's laws of motion, or electromagnetism, or Einstein's theory of gravity? These are not things that you can actually just open your eyes and see. Laws of nature are statements about how things operate uniformly across space and time, and those, as we'll see, are conclusions reached by an extraordinary act of reasoning and extrapolation from our experience. They're not in any way, shape, or form verified by just opening your eyes and looking. If that were the case, then we would have known about Newton's laws as soon as we had eyes. Human beings would have always known about Einstein's view of gravity, right? Why are these scientific laws ones that were only more or less discovered in the modern world, if all you have to do is just open your eyes to see them? You cannot see the past. The past, by definition, is gone. You can't access it. You would need a time machine, right? When we look at what we take to be remnants of the past, say archaeological evidence, we're looking at the present. You're not actually seeing the past. You're seeing something in the present which you infer represents the past, and then you get busy reasoning about it and trying to reconstruct what actually happened at this site that you're investigating, for example. When you pick up a history book and you're reading about the Romans, or you're reading about the French Revolution or the Nazis, you're not looking at these things, you are reading about these things. Mathematical truths. This one requires a little bit more explanation. If you look up at the top right there, you see 3 squares. A square, B square, C square. What if I were to ask you, just by looking with your eyes, if you were to combine A square and B square, would that equal C square? You could look all day long and you would never have certainty about that. The most you could possibly do is speculate, imagine, try to sort of, with your imagination, grow B and A into each other and try to picture whether that would equal C. That is not in any way certainty, right? But if you were to use Euclid's proof 47 here for the Pythagorean theorem, which involves dozens of steps, you would come to what's called rational certainty that, in fact, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. That is an act of reason, and that goes way beyond pure sense experience. In fact, the best geometers of the Greek world didn't even rely on sense experience. They just used reason. The same is true of moral truths. When you say that a man who is discriminating against another man based on race is violating his rights or his dignity or the moral law of God or justice or however you want to cash that out, you're not actually seeing what you just got through saying. You're not seeing the injustice. You're not seeing rights. You know, I mean, I can't pull my rights out of my pocket and put them out in front of you. You can't put rights into a pipe and smoke them, right? They're not physical entities. Likewise, when we say that someone's acting wrongly, we don't actually see physically the wrongness per se. What we're doing is we're looking at a behavior and then we're comparing it to some standard in our mind. Whether that's the law of God, whether that's the law of the state, the rules of the school, you have to apply these standards, these norms that are in your mind to the action. And then you say it does not conform to those norms. Well, that's, again, something going beyond sense experience. I know we're getting really philosophical here, but I'm going to go ahead and throw this one out too. Believe it or not, you cannot see other people's minds. This is a well-known fact established by the majority of philosophers. What you see are their eyes, you hear their voice, you see their movements, and you make some kind of inference or intuitive recognition of what they're thinking or what their motives are, what their desires are. But you're not literally experiencing them from the inside, as it were, right? You're not them, a conscious person looking at the world through their eyes. And believe it or not, the same thing is true about yourself. You do not literally with your eyes sense your own mind. Now, why am I going through the trouble of mentioning all of this? The answer is because for most philosophers who've thought about this, they have dismissed the idea that certainty is to be equated with sense experience. And that's really critical. I teach apologetics, and I regularly hear from students and from others that the essence of certainty is to see something with your own eyes. But as soon as you really stop and think about that and go deeply into that claim, you realize that can't possibly be true. Is personal experience sufficient for knowledge? Think about this. Of the things that we have personally experienced with our own eyes, much of what we know about them was conditioned by what we have not personally experienced. Here is what I call Island Baby. I use Island Baby in a lot of my lessons here at Providence. Island Baby is a thought experiment, and the idea is you're to imagine that this baby who's dropped off on this uninhabited island is somehow, some way, and don't worry about how we do it, it's a thought experiment, kept alive. So somehow we get nutrients into his body such that he grows up into an adult on this island. But here's the catch. He never has any exposure to other people, okay? He doesn't learn anything from anyone else because there is no one else to learn from. No books, no videos, nothing. And so the question is, what would he be like when he becomes an adult? Now, the first thing you need to understand is he would not have a language. He's not learned a language. And without words, as many philosophers have said, it's very difficult to imagine how you would think in terms of ideas. Would he know he's a human being? Would he know justice? There's no one to be just or unjust to. Would he know numbers? Would he have the idea of sets, of categories? Would he think in terms of history, of a future? And the more you start thinking it through, the more you realize, man, his mind would be pretty blank. And a lot of people who've considered this thought experiment have concluded that he would really be sort of at the level of an animal in terms of his thinking by the time he's an adult. Why is this important? Because it shows you that your bare sense experience is hardly sufficient to understand the world. You have to be taught to interpret the world. You have to be taught to interpret your sense experience. Here is a slide from the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. These tribesmen of the Kalahari are out hunting one day in the sands of the desert, and they stumble upon this Coke bottle. And this guy picks it up, and he has no idea what this thing is. He doesn't know what a bottle is. He doesn't know what glass is. He has no idea who made this. He doesn't even know it's empty, right? Because you'd already have to know it's supposed to be full. Now, what's interesting is, if you think about this literally, he is seeing the same thing we are seeing with his eyes. He's having the same visual experience, okay? But he's not seeing it as we see it. That's the difference. He sees what we see, but he does not see it as we see it. We see this as a bottle, as glass, as made in America, as something to contain Coca-Cola, and so forth. This means that seeing is not just believing. Now, in fact, he goes on to take this back to the village, and they throw all these different interpretations on it. Some say it's a gift from the gods. Some say it's just supposed to be used for cooking. Others for to play with, which makes it sort of comical, right? They don't know what it is, and so they have to guess. Most of what we think is self-evident to our senses is far from it. It is only because we are bringing background beliefs to our experience. So if you look at this image here on the bottom left, you would say right away that it's obvious that this is a classroom. It's just obvious. It's self-evident, you would say. You see desks, chairs, there's a map, you see computers, right? Clearly it's a classroom. Well, here are some kids who've grown up in desperate third world poverty. There are people who have very little contact with this kind of culture. And the question is, what would they see? If they walked in with no prior experience of any of these things, would they know that that thing up on the wall is a map? That it represents Earth? That's a one-dimensional representation of Earth. That those are computers that they turn on, that those are desks to be set up at. You know, would they know that? And the answer is they wouldn't. They would have to be told. Again, this is illustrating that your sense experience by itself is hardly sufficient to know things. So, the fundamental problem here with personal experience as the source of certainty is this. We are humans, not animals. And so we seek what philosophers call rational certainty, not merely sense experience. And if you look in these images here, you see a scientist, you see an astronomer, a guy with a book. And if you consider, what is it they're doing with their minds? They're not just looking with their eyes. They're thinking. They're thinking. They're reasoning. They're extrapolating, they're making inductions, they're comparing, they're contrasting, they're making inferences, they're questioning assumptions, they're interpreting in light of a larger framework that they've learned. These are all acts of reason. And by the way, they're using language, a language that they learn from their culture. And depending on the culture, that language is going to have certain degrees of richness or informativeness compared to others, right? So this is why we have school, right? Here's a picture of Providence and some of our kids walking up to the campus. Why are you sending kids to school? If all we need is our eyes, just send them into the backyard. Just go open your eyes, kids, go look in the backyard, be educated. No, we realize to be educated, to understand, requires training. It requires instruction, teachers, tradition, authorities. We have to learn how to interpret the world, to interpret it. Now, this leads to the big issue of worldviews. Worldviews. Acquiring the correct worldview. Well, what is a worldview? Here are some definitions that I've picked up from various authors. First, a systematic interpretation of reality as a whole. Second, a system of assertions that makes sense of total experience. Third, the widest view which the mind can take of things in an effort to grasp them together as a whole from the standpoint of a particular philosophy. That's what we're doing here at PCS. We're helping students to form a worldview, and presumably the correct worldview. Here you see a bunch of different worldviews. Now, in my class, I define a worldview as a system of beliefs about God, man, and nature. And you see in this diagram that they interconnect. Your ideas of God affect your ideas of nature, and so forth and so on. And you have all these different worldviews here: atheism, deism, Platonism, Islam, Hinduism, right? Buddhism. We look at these various worldviews and evaluate them, and I'll talk next time about how you go about evaluating worldviews. But this is ultimately what we're after, the correct worldview. Now let's think about how these concepts of God, man, and nature relate. To give you a sense of how worldview is a system of beliefs and how they connect to each other. So here we're relating God and man. We're just looking at how God and man relate. Our conception of God influences our conception of man. Our conception of man influences our conception of God. We say as Christians that man is made in God's image, that man is obligated to obey God, that man is sinful and in need of salvation. Now, notice, all those statements are about man, but they're statements that have reference to God. So they're theological interpretations of man. How about this? Relating God and nature. We say God created, conserves, and controls the entire natural order. We say that nothing is possible apart from God as the creator and sustainer of all things. There is no such thing as chance that's out there that's over God. God transcends the natural order, but is immanent in it. So here, again, we're talking about God's relationship to nature, nature's relationship to God. And when you compare worldviews, you see that all the different worldviews are going to answer these questions in different ways. Finally, man's relationship to nature. We say man, as Christians, is Lord and steward of nature. That we're created to know nature, and that nature is created to be known by man. In my apologetics class, I have a unit where we talk about the scientific revolution. And I give them original source material to see that the scientific revolution was premised in part on this idea that God created man and nature to fit, that man has the sort of mind that can know nature, and that nature has the sort of properties that can be known by man. And that fit is ordained by the creator of both man and nature. And this inspired the early scientists to go and try to find the laws of nature. Many historians have actually argued this is why you don't see the discovery of the laws of nature outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We also say man is unique, that he's inherent, that he has inherent dignity as God's image bearer, that he's not just a mere animal, right? Now, of course, all of these propositions are denied by other worldviews. If I were an atheist, I would deny every single one of those propositions that I just listed off. Why? Because, first of all, I'm kicking God out of my worldview. So my worldview is now reduced to just man and nature, right? If there's no God, there's just man and nature. Now I ask myself, well, how to relate man and nature? Well, what's going to happen is I'm going to subsume man under nature, because nature is really the ultimate. Okay? And man just comes out of nature, this purposeless, material, impersonal, blind process. That's going to be my interpretation. Now, a worldview I like to think of as an ultimate paradigm for viewing reality. Now, this, I think, should be pretty intuitive to you if you think about your own college experience. A paradigm is a standardized set of beliefs for interpreting a domain of study. It is an interpretive framework, a lens through which we view and make sense of a specialized field of inquiry or expertise. So here are a bunch of paradigms. If you study medicine to be a doctor, you're learning paradigms for identifying illness. If you're an investor, you're learning paradigms for analyzing the stock market, for example. An engineer for learning safe construction. A military officer for battlefield moves, for strategy, right? Lawyers, psychiatrists, teachers, historians, detectives, they're all learning paradigms. That's what we call a major. You go to college to major in something, and what do? You focus in on that particular domain of study, and you try to master as much as you can. You read all the textbooks and so forth. And what you're doing is you're forming a paradigm, an interpretive framework for approaching your field, whether that's law or medicine, oil and gas, whatever. A worldview then is just a paradigm of all paradigms. It is a super paradigm. It is the paradigm for interpreting all of reality. And what this means here is that worldviews therefore must necessarily contradict each other. And you see this bumper sticker here, that this is, for those of you who may have seen the tolerance bumper sticker, where you see all the different worldviews spelled out into tolerance, and the idea is that somehow you're supposed to sort of, I don't know, coexist, or they all go together somehow. And this one is pushing back on that by saying, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Worldviews contradict. They can't all be true. For example, the world was created or it wasn't. Two options. It was created or it wasn't. There's objective good and evil, or there's not. Men will be judged for their sins, or they won't. Jesus rose from the dead, or he didn't, right? And we can go on and on and on. Christianity makes a number of propositions, asserts a number of propositions which are either true or false. And many of those propositions directly contradict Islam, directly contradict atheism, directly contradict Buddhism, and so forth and so on. And the same is true of theirs. If you're an atheist, you are contradicting the Christian worldview. If you're a Muslim, you're contradicting the Christian worldview. Worldviews cannot all be true. They cancel each other out. There's a collision at the core of each worldview. Now, the problem, though, is that a lot of Americans today don't get this. And so they form what some have called a world view, world in the sense of being like throwing all these ideas into a blender and then spinning them up, right? They form their worldviews like they form their dinner at a buffet or a salad bar. They just kind of pick and choose. They say, I'll take a little bit of Buddhism, I'll take a little bit of Christianity, I'll take a little bit of, some Tai Chi over here, whatever it might be. They're trying to pick little bits and pieces of ideas that they think somehow, some way can work together. That's called syncretism. Many people in our culture are syncretists. They are adopting lots of different contradictory ideas and then trying to smash them into their minds and live that way with the chaos and the confusion, and does not work. You cannot live out a contradictory worldview. It leads to a contradictory life. You cannot put contradictory pieces of a puzzle together. It just does not work. So then all of this to say, if you're still with me here, I know this is pretty heavy, but all of this to say, we're now at the real question here. Is there a way to verify, there's that word again, not merely justify, but to verify a worldview? Not just your belief about who won the game last night, but your beliefs about ultimate reality, about God, man, and nature. Is there a way to know which of those very fundamental beliefs are true? And to know with certainty, on the basis of infallible evidence. That is really the ultimate question that has occupied the best minds of history. Now, postmodernism has answered that question in the negative. Postmodernism is, in a sense, the rejection of that project. it says you cannot achieve verification of a worldview. Here's a quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica. In Western philosophy, a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, I talked about that in an earlier lesson, and relativism, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. Now, I think you can see that I've put these into different colors, right? The skepticism, subjectivism, relativism are in orange. The acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power in blue. I think that the blue explains the yellow. I think that particularly in light of the world wars and World War II, the Nazi and communist regimes in Europe, that philosophers in the 20th century were so fearful of people taking their worldviews, their philosophies, and imposing them on others that they resorted to skepticism. I think that's part of the explanation. The idea here, if you think about it, is if you think of truth and error as wheat and weeds in a field, okay? So you've got a field with wheat and weeds growing up. The idea is the postmodern is more fearful of error than they are concerned about truth. And so what they do is instead of going through the field and trying to pull out the weeds, they just douse the whole field with herbicide, with skepticism. They destroy it all. So you can't know anything, right? The idea then would be, if you can't know anything, well then Hitler didn't know anything, right? The Nazis didn't know anything. And so they can't possibly be confident and dogmatic anymore because they can't really know anything. And that seems like a pretty reasonable solution at first. The problem is you can't live that way. It's impossible for human beings to live in a state of consistent skepticism. We'll talk more about that next time. Postmodernism is a pragmatic solution. It does not ultimately work. I'm going to go ahead here and move on to this next slide. I would argue that the post-Christian postmodern predicament, because postmodernism is a post-Christian predicament. It comes after Christendom, after Christianity was the standard worldview in Western culture, okay? That this post-Christian predicament of postmodernism is where the pre-Christian Greek quest for truth ended. If you think about Greek philosophy prior to the advent of the gospel and the ministry of Jesus and his apostles, the Greek experience is basically three stages. You have the emergence of philosophy against uncriticized belief in tradition. So they relied on experience and reason to critique authority, to critique Homer, to critique Hesiod and so forth in the Greek mythologies and traditions. The idea was that by reason and experience, you can figure it all out. You can get to the right worldview. Well, that led to stage two. Stage two is where, on the basis of reason and experience, the philosophers start to pull apart from each other. And they form different schools: Platonism, Stoicism, Aristotelianism, so forth and so on. Which is to say, they disagree. They're contradicting each other. They're coming to radically different interpretations of the world, different worldviews, on the basis of reason and experience. So that leads to the third stage, skepticism. That is where Greek philosophy ends, historically and logically. Skepticism. You just can't know. You can't know anything. Tradition doesn't tell you anything for certain, and reason and experience don't tell you anything for certain. If there's anything that reason tells us, it's that reason can't tell us anything. That's skepticism. It was into this climate that the Apostle Paul went into Athens. Mars Hill, Acts chapter 17. It says that the Greek philosophers were there listening. And Paul goes to them and he preaches Christ. And he preaches Christ based on revelation, based on the assumption that God himself, the Creator, has revealed himself, disclosed himself in time and space by a special means, by miracles, by prophets, by holy scriptures, and above all, by the incarnation of his Son, Jesus Christ. Luke says this, "Now all the Athenians," these would be the philosophers who are accustomed to questioning authority by reason, "Now all the Athenians used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new." Sound familiar? When you think about American culture right now, it's year after year, month after month, new ideas coming out, right? People get excited about this new theory about this, the new theory about that. Always learning, never coming to a knowledge of the truth. Luke is sort of criticizing the Greeks here. This is a little bit, biting, where he's saying basically the Greek philosophers never did arrive at a knowledge of truth. They never did get to certainty of truth. And that's why hundreds of years after Plato, they're still hanging out in Athens, debating each other. Now, what does Paul say, though? Verse 23, "What you worship in ignorance, this I," what? "Proclaim to you." I proclaim it to you. He's not reasoning his way to it by means of a syllogism. He's not putting something under a microscope. He's proclaiming something on the basis of revelation. And this leads to the last slide here, the conclusion of today's presentation and a preview of next time. Everything that I've said, this entire presentation, is directed to this particular conclusion. The real debate is over the role of the other two options for achieving certainty. We talked about personal sense experience, seeing, touching, and I've given you reasons to think that that can't possibly be the answer, okay? The two other options are reason and revelation. Reason and revelation. Those are the other two means of trying to achieve certainty about the correct worldview. And so more specifically, as we'll see next time, option 2 is reason alone, without revelation. Reason alone, without revelation. That was the cry of the Enlightenment. Reason alone, without revelation. Option 3 is what Paul had just done. Reason illuminated by revelation. That is ultimately the question. We are rational beings. We're not animals. We don't just go around looking at stuff. We think, we reason, we interpret, we infer, we synthesize, we analyze, we debate. We're rational creatures. We want rational certainty. The question is, can reason alone get us to a certain understanding of reality as a whole? Or are we in need of revelation? And we'll look at those two options next time we gather. I hope by this point that you see why the pursuit of truth is arduous, why it's difficult, why it's not for the faint of heart, and why there is so much disagreement out there. This is not easy stuff. But it's my belief that the answers have been found. And so next time we meet, I'm going to try to give you a very concise understanding of how Christians have historically tried to answer this question. All right, well, thanks so much for joining me again, and I'll see you back next time.